Crop Growers offers all types of policies, including basic yield policies that provide coverage based on harvested yield per acre, and revenue policies with both upside and downside price protection. Cost depends on the crop, policy, and your location. That's why our crop insurance agents help you price out the best options and coverage level for your business. Crop Growers through Farm Credit is here to help you weather your financial ups and downs, no matter what crops up. Learn more at cropgrowers.com.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our third day of Dairy Day. Today, we are going to be talking about dairy markets and labor, and we have three awesome speakers lined up for you guys. Our first speaker is Dr. Chris Wolf. He is the E.V. Baker Professor of Agriculture Economics at Cornell's Dyson School of Applied Economics. And today, he's going to be giving us an overview, update on some dairy market updates. So we look forward to what you have to say, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. I talked to you all last year, or at least the same meeting last year, and hard to believe where we're at this year compared to last year. So what I thought I would do is quickly review 2020, or not so quickly. I'll try to be quick and not get too sidetracked, and then talk a little bit about the dairy market policy, the dairy market and policy outlook for 2021. Right, that's the whole story of 2020 is COVID. We're all sick of it, and hopefully we're nearing the finish line. We came into 2020 looking at the markets, thinking that things were fairly well balanced in terms of producing a pretty good farm milk price. We were looking for the highest farm milk prices since 2014. To be fair, we did actually end up getting pretty decent farm milk prices, but it was kind of a wild ride. On average, by the way, let me just say that. There were some people that got much better farm milk prices than others. It kind of depended very much on where you were at and where your milk was going. And so if the average kind of hides a whole lot of variation that's going on behind that, which really is unfortunate for you if you ended up on the lower side. But COVID basically necessitated very large and very quick adjustments in the dairy supply chain. FAFH is food away from home. Food away from home was effectively shut down, at least temporarily, in many locations, and that's a pretty important part of the story for dairy demand. Just briefly, you look at what happened with unemployment, and this matters for several reasons for dairy, including the fact that if people aren't working, then obviously their income is going to be curtailed severely. We went from 3.5–4% unemployment to 15%, with 23 million jobs kind of being lost very quickly. We've recovered a lot of that in percentage terms. We haven't recovered, but we've only recovered a little more than half of that in terms of jobs lost. We're still down 11 million jobs from where we were a year ago before this started. Anyway, being part of the reason with the rate coming down to 6.7%, that looks not terrible. It's much higher than we had been the last few years. But part of the deal there is if you stop looking for a job, you're no longer unemployed. And that's kind of happened with a lot of people, unfortunately, in the country. And so this is what this looks like, just to put it in perspective. These are the these are recessions going all the way back to 1948. and what happens with the percent job losses relative to where they were before the recession. And so what stands out, with this most recent one, which was, again, entirely a function of COVID, is how far down it went, right? So that's the biggest job loss in percentage terms since the Great Depression, easily. And then, you saw a fairly quick rebound, kind of a V recovery, which is what we'd like to see, but that's then stalled out in the last couple months here because we're still dealing with a lot of COVID, and there's only so much you can do with curbside pickup, and we're working remotely. In contrast, the recession from 13 years ago now was a very, very slow recovery, exceptionally slow recovery. It took more than 6 years to get back to the job, but hopefully can see that turn back up in a V because that's your customers, right? If we're looking at what happened, consumer expenditures, which again is 2/3 of the GDP in this country, dropped by 18.5%, and it recovered again fairly quickly, but has kind of stalled out. Because again, there's only so much we can do until we get this under control. Getting more specific to food, from February to March to April, we ended up down 50% on food away from home expenditures in the country as a whole. Total food sales down 22.4%. And that's in part because these expenditure numbers include taxes and tips. So we've been in a situation in the last decade where we had been spending more on average on food away from home than food at home. And part of the reason we spend more is because we pay for wages and tips in there for the service part of the eating away from home. So even though we still eat maybe 3/4 of our meals at home, we've been spending more on food away from home. That matters for employment and investment on the restaurant side, but it also matters to the dairy farmers because we eat differently when we eat away from home. So Americans in general eat a lot more butterfat when they eat out than they do when they're at home. They eat more cheese when they eat out than they do when they're at home. Although the cheese one has been recovering better than the butterfat one has recently. And that's part of the story here that we're going to talk about. Food service and drinking places down, by more than 50%, and then recovering. Supermarket foot traffic spiking up during when we kind of went to on the buying binge there in the beginning of or middle of April to the end of, middle of March to the end of March, and then kind of being below. So we have less supermarket foot traffic, less visits to stores than we did consistently previously because people are, trying to not go out as much. Sit down restaurant foot traffic down dramatically. Number of employees for food service and drinking places down 50% in April, and then recovering, but still down almost 20%. And so, well, how do you do this? How can you still keep eating but have all this less, traffic even going to supermarket? Well, meal delivery services have been way up. So we're looking at a 5-fold increase in meal delivery service use in the country here, with it being things like Uber Eats, Postmates, DoorDash, Grubhub. And so those have been good businesses to be in. As people have been ordering takeout and doing delivery, not just of like restaurant food, right? But of getting your groceries. Amazon is, delivering groceries now in something like 2 hours, most places in the country. And so that's kind of where the shift has been. And those type service industries, the delivery ones have been doing good, but the other service industries have been getting crushed. The other thing that's happened is food has become more expensive with, this is the most recent numbers the USDA have. So I think it has declined a little bit since then, but still almost 5% year-over-year increase in food prices. And that's a big deal because it kind of hits lower income families a lot harder because they spend a bigger percentage of their income on food. But also, I mean, part of this that's going on here is just the cost of getting food to people has increased from the farm level all the way through the retail, right? If you think about the health protocols, the differences that Rich is going to talk about as far as labor costs, you know, those go on the farm, those go on if you go to Tops or Wegmans or wherever you do your shopping. You know, they're having to do more cleaning, they're having maybe more sick leave that's going to have to get paid for. So, you know, I guess I would be careful in thinking that maybe that was gouging or anything, or just profit holding that's going on. So when we think specifically about the dairy market, package size is up for many products. Okay, so for example, yogurt, the smaller containers of yogurt, those sales is down, but the larger container sales of yogurt are up. So you know, the hypothesis there would be that people used to do the grab and go for breakfast on the way out the door on the way to work, or maybe they took it with them and ate it at work. And instead, if you're going to eat at home, then you're going to buy a bigger container. So butter and cream consumption in total is down a little bit. And that has to do with food away from home versus food at home. Now, we're eating more butter at home than we used to, but it's not quite making up for the amount of butter and cream that was consumed in restaurants. And processed cheese consumption is up, which is kind of interesting. Which is to say, eating at home now, there's more people doing things like macaroni and cheese and using Velveeta to make recipes and things like that. Yeah, and then finally, the fluid milk growth has been really big in extended shelf life packaging and organic, as well as more whole fat milk being consumed at home. On the supply side, you know, losing these food service outlets necessitated changing the product mix, the packaging, led to some shortages in some cases of packaging, led to some logistics issues, led to some issues with maybe not having as much inventory and cold storage capacity in some situations as would have been, you know, best to deal with it. And I think those are changes that are going to get looked at in the future. Do we need to think about having more storage capacity in some places? I mean, think about what happened. Maybe didn't happen as much here, but it definitely happened in the Midwest when we moved to doing a lot more corn and ethanol, right? So it used to be the case that most of the corn, or a large percentage of the corn, let me be careful, large percentage of the corn in Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana would go to the Mississippi River, get put on big barges and go down the river to head to export markets. When we suddenly decided to end up putting 30% of the corn into ethanol, we put up a lot of grain bins all over the Midwest, and actually it was a good time to be selling grain bins. You know, the same type of questions here. Are we going to have to hold more inventory? Do we want to have a little bit more capacity in case we have some disruptions in some of these? And then if we do that, then it's going to be expensive. It's going to get reflected into food prices and costs. But anyway, in the short term, what happened was that there was a lot of milk dumped in April. This is a graph that shows milk dumping in all federal orders going back 20 years, so it's a little bit silly. Usually there's always a little bit of milk dumping, usually maybe 0.3% of milk ends up dumped because of you know, sitting too long in the truck before it could get to the factory, or because the factory went down for some service reason, or for cleaning, or because there was some, you know, weird issue that happened with some contamination or something. So there's always a little bit of milk dumped, but in April we dumped 350 million pounds of milk. 131 million of it was done in the Northeast. The Northeast had by far the most milk dumped, which I think reflects a lot of how close the Northeast dairy markets are to the consumer. And also the fact that, you know, there was a lot of milk in the Northeast that's going into things like cream cheese and cottage cheese and school lunches and things like that. So fortunately, the milk dumping, for the most part, went back down to normal levels. So you look at the black line, that's 2020 in the Northeast, 131 million pounds, and then back down to normal-ish, although the Northeast milk marketing orders had a longer-term issue with dumping milk. If we look at it in percentage terms, 5% of the milk that was pooled was dumped in the Northeast in April. So even though it was the biggest quantity amount, it was not the biggest percentage amount. That was in Florida, which had to do with Florida's mostly a fluid market, a beverage market. And so that them adjusting to that, they dumped 14% of the milk, but a much smaller quantity than the Northeast in that month. So an average of 2.5% of the milk was dumped. And then we kind of went back to normal. You look at the Northeast, 0.3, 0.25% back to normal. And then co-ops also, as you guys know, instituted base programs or something that they, what I would call a base program, maybe they have a different name for it. And that was to kind of encourage cutting back milk production. And what you saw, this is US average daily milk production, those base programs, and some other issues that happened actually resulted in milk production going down pretty hard there from April to May. You can see that was a pretty big decline, then kind of flattish from May to June, and then just following a normal seasonality. But you see the red line there, which is 2020, ends up well above the previous years for July, August, September, October, November. So, there was some cutback because of these supply chain issues and because of the co-op base programs, but it was quickly kind of put back into place. Percentage change in milk production shows up dramatically there, right? We went from being 2.75% over a year earlier in March to about 1.25% in April to being negative 0.5%, so down 0.5% over a year earlier in May, which is pretty dramatic. As long-term average, long-term trend in percent milk production over a year earlier is about 1.7, between 1.7 and 1.8%. So being 0.5% below is, well below trend. But those adjustments, maybe some culling happened. Maybe there was some adjustments to diets and rations, but then we put that milk production kind of right back. And, we look at November, which is the most recent one available. We'll get the December one here in the next week. But the November being 3% over the November of 2019 means that we were well above trend. So kind of roller coaster on milk production. US cow numbers, again, kind of heavier culling, which had, heavier culling from March through June, but then building the herd back up, especially in the big milk producing states, especially in places like, Texas. Milk production has been, and South Dakota on that I-29 corridor, milk production has been growing like gangbusters. And then US milk per cow per day, again, that was down, but point out here, this is total milk production, hides the component test. We've slowly been seeing component tests inching up between genetics and diet formulation for the dairy cows. And I wanted to point out that, butterfat test really has been going up. And we had an average test for the United States of over 4% in November, 4.05%. So this hides a little bit how much the increase in butterfat has been. So yeah, milk production is up 3% over a year earlier, but butterfat test is 4% higher than a year first, or sorry, is not 4% higher, but is over 4%, which is the highest milk fat test on average that this country had ever recorded. So what we ended up with the farm milk price was, that it varied widely depending on where you were marketing. If you look at the US average by quarter here, strong quarter for all milk for quarter one, terrible quarter for quarter two, just looking at the all milk, and then quarter 3 and 4 were strong again. You look at the payments there, the dairy margin coverage program, which again only applies to the first 5 million pounds, but if you had it, you collected on the first 5 million pounds $2.38 in the second quarter, and then you kind of paid premiums, didn't collect anything in the other quarters. And then the coronavirus food assistance program was a pretty big payment that ended up averaging, if you could get it on all your milk, was averaging in that about $2.45 a hundredweight range, averaged across all 3 quarters. So, we're in the situation where usually we're looking at, government payments to the farm being more like, maybe 25, 30 cents on a typical year, and they're going to be much higher than that if you ended up in a situation where you collected all of the CFAP payments and maybe got some DMC in there. The other thing the government did in response was the food assistance programs. So SNAP benefits, SNAP, which is what we used to call food stamps, that was up heavily and was up a great deal and stays up actually still. An emergency food assistance program also, but this new program, the coronavirus food assistance program, part of it was the Farmers to Families Food Box program, where they made these boxes and they were much more targeted. So there were dairy boxes and dairy was required to be part of it, including 2% in whole milk be part of these boxes that were distributed to families in need. They ended up with 4 rounds in 2020, and we just had round 5 announced, was it about a week ago, 10 days ago, for another 1.5 billion. So we're looking at 5 to 5.5 billion total between 2020 and 2021 so far, with 20% of that spent on dairy. That's a big deal because it's been propping up demand and getting product out of the market that might have otherwise ended up in inventory. Food box dairy purchases for 2020. These are estimates that I made using AMS data, which is, so some people, it's hard to track actually how much went into these food boxes, I guess is how I should say it, because there was a little bit of flexibility on what was included, right? It could be whole milk or it could be 2%. It could be cheese or cottage cheese or, you know, things like that. So the kind of depended on who was putting the boxes together. So it's a little bit harder to track. But anyway, ended up about 1% of the fat in the whole country that was produced last year ended up distributed in food boxes, and about 0.5% on solids not fat between the cheese and other products that were in there. If we look at government purchases by quarter, you can see this is butter. So, you know, we've got the coronavirus food assistance program is in the gray, and you can see how it really ramped up. We really weren't, generally the government doesn't purchase a ton of butter, a little bit of butter for some food assistance programs, and really none for school. And so it really ramped. There was some trade mitigation that was in there, which is the green purchases. Okay. So the green bars were trade mitigation, which really started at the end of 2019 and continued into 2020. And then you've got the red, which is the coronavirus food assistance, and then the gray, which is the food box program. So we really ended up purchasing about 1% of the butter produced in 2020 across these programs, which really helps prop this up, because that would have been an additional 1%, possibly, that either would have been exported or put into storage. If we look at cheese purchases, that's a little bit different. The government, the blue is the schools, okay? And so we always kind of purchase some cheese between schools, lunches, breakfast, things of that nature, and needy families. But still, you can see the gray shows up as and the green show up, the trade mitigation in green, and the gray in the food box programs. And so the government purchases about 1% of the 1.5%, excuse me, of the cheese produced, as a rough estimate. And that did a lot to prop up these markets. And in fact, if you look at when the announcements were made about each one of these government purchases for $1 billion or more, you could really see the markets react. And so it was definitely propping up demand during this time, in addition to helping families that needed the food. Currently, we've got farm milk prices here are well above where New Zealand and the European Union are. That's only important in as much as if, you know, we weren't having, for example, the government propping up the demand a bit, we would probably have a lot of downward pressure to tend more towards those prices of New Zealand and the European Union. Looking at milk production change in the major exporters, the US is in red here. You can see down a lot in the May area, and then bouncing back, with the European Union milk production being up strongly, as well as the US. New Zealand, not so much. So we exported milk. Exports, volumes of exports was up in 2020 over 2019. and the value was up. So not only did we do more volume, but we did it at a little bit higher prices than we had been doing in 2019. So in export markets, we're actually a really good story for the most part for dairy. And that was largely driven by Asia, in particular China, who seems to have had an insatiable appetite, not just for dairy products, I should point out, but for the grains also, right? If you've been watching the news, you've seen we're going to export a record amount of soybeans, and that gets into, that matters to you guys because soybeans were trading at 15 bucks on the Board of Trade the other day, and corn was trading above 5, which is good news if you've got, feed to sell, and not very good news if you're going to end up buying. Kind of waiting to see with what happens with South America. South America in a bit of a drought, which is driving part of this. We've got low stocks, and China's buying a lot. So China and other Southeast Asian countries purchased a lot of U.S. dairy exports in 2020. That helped, and importantly, it helped offset the fact that Mexican U.S. dairy exports to Mexico, let me put it that way, were down significantly in 2020 over 2019. Which has a lot to do with the coronavirus situation in Mexico and the fact that the Mexico GDP is down something like 9% over a year earlier. And frankly, Mexico economy was not doing great prior to that, in actually part for several factors, but part of it was also because of the trade war issues that had been happening. So the point is that Mexico's economy not doing great and then got hammered down much more, and that affected how much they've been buying from us. We don't have real high stocks of American cheese, which is cheddar or whey. We do have a lot of butter stocks right now. So sopping up this extra milk production, we've been running the butter churns and the powder dryers. We currently have the largest amount of butter in cold storage since 1993, which is quite a while. And so that's kind of overhanging markets at the current time. USDA WASDE outlook that just came out thinks that for 2021, exports are on a fat-based uses are going to be up over 5%. Skim solids exports up 3%. That would be tremendous. So that's something to watch. That's probably partly dependent on what happens with some of these other economies like Mexico recovering a bit from coronavirus. Also is impacted by things like exchange rates, right? We have a strong dollar right now. A little bit weaker dollar would help with some of these exports. What you think of that kind of depends on where you sit. USDA currently projecting class 3 prices about 17 bucks and class 4 about 14. That would be higher class 4 prices than 2020, but lower class 3 prices significantly by $1.50 or more. All milk price about $17.65, which is kind of a long run average. USDA is pretty conservative about some of these estimates. Futures market right now is strong for class 3 in the near term. Looking to average about 18 bucks over the year. That'd be nice. Actually, that would be fairly strong. In part, it's because we've had some strong cheese prices, strong-ish, and they've recovered recently. You can see the red line going up in the last couple weeks, and that's in part due to that most recent purchase from the food box program. There's some kind of feeling that maybe the next administration will be less likely to use the food box and more likely to put funds into the SNAP program. Something to wait and see. Butter prices have been kind of in the doldrums. This looks like a lot of up and down, but look at the axis is only about a 20-cent change there. Not strong butter prices, partly because of those high stocks that we've been looking at. And so what we've seen here, in part because of the high feed prices that I'm looking at, if you look at the projection of the dairy margin coverage program, and I hope that everybody that wanted to signed up for that. We're now looking at the possibility of actually having some decent payments in 2021 out of the dairy margin coverage program. And that is in large part driven actually by these high feed costs. So you see that going, that downward trend in the margin, which is again, all milk price minus feed cost. It's been declining because we have corn at $5 and soybeans at 15. That's driving it. And so the likelihood of a net benefit is pretty high at the current time. Kind of wait to see what happens. I guess we'd rather just have high profits without the government payments. And let me just kind of wrap it up here by saying, there's a whole lot of uncertainty, especially unless and until we get the coronavirus under control, ramp up these vaccinations, and we can hopefully start to get back to normal in the third, fourth quarter this year. Even sooner would be better. There are government lockdowns in some places. One thing to point out, though, is it's not just government lockdowns driving behavior. Even in states that aren't doing lockdowns, you're seeing people that are not going out and not spending money because they're worried about their health, even if the government of South Dakota doesn't say you shouldn't go out. So it's not just the lockdown, it's consumer attitudes related to that. Are the government food purchases going to continue? I think as long as we continue in these lockdowns, there's going to be an appetite for spending money there. How they spend it's going to matter, because the way it was done under the previous administration definitely heavily was weighted towards dairy, which was a good thing. I think it's likely to be less direct payments, like those coronavirus food assistance payments that were made directly to farmers. I don't think you're going to see anything like that, but it remains to be seen. Everybody's kind of watching supply and butter inventory. And then, we can talk about it if anybody has questions, but the split between the butter and cheese prices has been part of what's been driving those negative PPDs that you've been seeing on your checks, in addition to other ones. So, 2021 right now looks like, it looks like a year that's maybe a little bit lower price on average than 2020, hopefully a lot less volatility, but it really depends on these things like the recovery from the pandemic, what the US government does for food purchases, and whether the export markets recover. So I think I'm just a little bit over there, and I will, sorry if I went real quickly. I had a lot more slides than I probably should have. This is what tends to happen when you do market outlook, I think. And I'm happy to take your questions later.
Great, thanks, Chris. So our next speaker is Dr. Richard Stup. He is with Cornell University's Ag Workforce Development Program. Rich is going to be talking to us today about some labor updates.
Should. All right, thanks, Chris. That's a lot of data, a lot of numbers, and so now we'll shift gears, folks. I'm going to be a bit more text-based. I wish I could show you a few numbers, but it's more of a legal update for this year. So that's where we're going to go. So there was a lot going on, of course, in terms of labor laws in New York. We all know about what happened in 2019 with the new set of labor laws that came into place. Well, in reality, 2020 was just as busy because there were edits to those laws from 2019, because there were aspects of those of the FLPA that simply, that simply weren't workable. And so those edits had to be made, and those are really important edits, and that's what I'm going to talk with you a bit about. I'm also going to talk about the new permanent sick leave law that's put in place. I'm calling it permanent because this is different than the COVID-19 sick leave that was put in place by the federal government and by the state. We're going to talk briefly about the minimum wage increase. We had that happen again this year, and a couple of take homes that we'll get to. But before I jump into all that, as Chris said, we've got this whole COVID-19 thing that still overhangs everything, and certainly the agricultural workforce has been caught up directly in COVID-19 and has been a big part of the focus throughout the pandemic. Just briefly update, so vaccines are on the way, and those vaccines are safe and they are effective, and they are in phase 1B now. So phase 1A, I won't say it's done. That's all the healthcare workers and emergency responders and so forth. 1B then included a lot of other people. That was supposed to also, it does include agricultural workers, so many of you. But at this point, the state does not have enough of those vaccines yet. And so their ag workers are not included yet in phase 1B. Sorry, let me say it this way. They're included in phase 1B, but not yet eligible to go get the vaccine. So the state's going to let us know as soon as that is, and I'll try to let you know as soon as I can too. But you can't go and make an appointment for your farm workers yet to get the vaccine. Quarantine, this is an important deal. I've had a couple of producers talk to me lately about quarantine concerns because COVID-19 is out there hitting some rural communities that weren't very much affected just yet. And so questions were about quarantine. Remember that farm workers are essential workers, so they can work when they're quarantined. Remember, quarantine and isolation are different. Isolation means that the person has actually either got symptoms, they're sick, or they were tested positive, so they are sick, they can't work. But folks that just might have been exposed and so they're in quarantine, they can still work. So another important detail is that quarantine was dropped from 14 days to 10 days by the state of New York. So it's a little shorter. And if they follow these conditions, farm employees have no symptoms, stay quarantined outside work, get symptoms, screened at work, wear a face mask, stop work if they get sick, all according to that interim guidance, which you can Google, interim guidance for prevention and response to COVID-19 at farms, or you can go to our website, agworkforce.cals.cornell.edu. Then farm workers can still work. Brief disclaimer as we jump into these laws, I'm not a lawyer, can't give you legal advice. If you have specific questions about your situation, you need to get a lawyer that understands the labor laws. We had in 2020 some new definitions. That was one of the big problems with the original act back there in 2019. It used the word employee, it used the word laborer, used the word worker almost interchangeably, and nobody knew, what exactly applied in any given situation. Laws have to define what they're talking about, and this law did a poor job with that originally. So they made some changes under the 2020 Budget Act, and one of which was really important. That's this definition. And if you take a look at that, it's actually that first bullet. Farm laborer shall mean any individual who works on a farm and is an employee under Article 19 of this chapter. Now that's one sentence really is a definition unto itself. And then the next words, if you follow me, is another definition. Members of an employee's immediate family who are related to the third degree of consanguinity or affinity shall not be considered to be employed on a farm if they work on a farm out of familial obligation or not paid wages or other compensation based on their hours or days of work. So that's kind of a negative definition. It says they are not. So we'll break this down a little bit. But first of all, I want you to understand that this definition includes all full and part-time workers, so no part-time exclusions here. It does include foreign guest workers, so the H-2A program, of course, and anybody else, any other immigrant, essentially anybody that's working on a farm fits into this new definition, interns and apprentices. This definition is important because only farm laborers are now subject to the overtime and day of rest provisions. Those are some of the most important parts of the original law from FLPA. So it now only applies to farm labor. So if a person does not fit that definition, they then are exempt from overtime and day of rest. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. So as I mentioned, that definition, and there was the second part of it, which is kind of the definition of family members who are not farm laborers. So members of an employee's immediate family, I won't read all that again. It has three pieces to it. The first piece is this third degree of my favorite word, consanguinity, which means blood relations, or affinity, which essentially means by law. So we're talking both either by blood or by law. That's the first definition. And I'll share, I think I have a slide. No, I will share what that means. The third degree of consanguinity means within two, so we count, so your children and your parents are 1 degree separated from you. Your grandparents are 2 degrees separated because there's a person between you and them, your parents. Your grandchildren will be separated by 2 degrees. Your nieces or nephews would be 2 degrees of separation because, 3 degrees of separation, because the people between you and your niece or nephew is your parents, your brother or sister, 1 and 2, and then 3, your nieces or nephews. So that's as far out as it goes. Nieces or nephews, grandchildren, grandparents, and by blood or by law, all fit within that 3rd degree. The second piece is this familial obligation. Now, this is a funny thing that the state came up with this term. If you look for a legal definition of this term, You will not find it. It's not a legal term. If you look for a common definition of this term, look in Webster's or something for what familial obligation is, you will not find it. This is a new term that New York State came up with. It essentially means, in New York State Department of Labor, which is important important how they interpret it, they say it is what it sounds like to you and me. Many of us grew up on farms or have been connected to a business. We know that when it's a family business, there's this sense of obligation that often goes with that. While you might not feel obligated to work your whole career there, when the farm needs help and it's a busy time of the year and they're making hay or whatever, a lot of times family will pitch in. That's all familial obligation. And sometimes people are actually working their whole careers at that farm because they have a sense of this family obligation. So that needs to be present. And then third, the compensation is not based on their hours or days of work, which I think is probably the most difficult part of that law. Because, for example, if I'm running a farm and my nephew works for me, but only works on the weekends because he's in school during the day or during the week, I can't pay him by the hour if I want to define him as a family member. I can't pay him by the hour because that takes him out, because that means his compensation would be based on hours or days of work. So I'd have to give him a stipend of some kind, a small salary or something like that. But it makes it difficult then because he might want to work more hours in the summertime. But we need to work around this. And the way to work around that is by paying him for the duties, the jobs that he's completed, not for the hours it takes him to get that done. So that's the solution to that. Family member, third degree, family obligation, and then compensation not based on hours or days of work. If that's a family member and they fit all three of those things, they can be exempt from overtime and day of rest. There's another possibility here. So let's consider people on your farm who are not family members. They're not related, so they definitely wouldn't fit there. So all other sectors of the economy have people who are exempt from overtime. And through these changes that happened last year, the Department of Labor has recognized that these similar exemptions also exist in agriculture. So what we're looking at here are the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions. And basically what we're doing is if some of our supervisors or some of our managers are truly supervisor, they've got responsibility for at least two or more other people. And they truly supervise them, not just a team leader or a shift leader or something like that, but they're truly that person's supervisor. They may fit into most likely the executive exemption. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but if you can put some of your managers essentially into some of these categories, then they would also be exempt from overtime and day of rest. So here's a flow chart that we put together to try to wrap your mind around this. You've got a couple of opportunities to get employees in your farm exempt from overtime and day of rest. Kind of down the left-hand column here, you start at the top with that decision block related to the employer, yes or no. If they are related, you're kind of going down the left-hand side and trying to answer those three questions that we just talked about. And if it's a yes to all three of those questions, then we've got a family member who can be exempt. If it's a no to any of those questions, then that pushes us over to the right side of the chart. And there we've got the executive, the administrative, and the professional test. Now, I'm going to show you what the executive, admin, and professional tests are. But some of our employees, some of our non-family employees, again, who are managers, supervisors, or some skilled professionals, may fit there. And if they do, we can get them out of overtime. So let's start with the executive exemption. I think this one will be used most widely on farms in New York. So for a person to be executive, they have to meet all of the following tests, not just one or two. You have to meet them all. So their primary duty consists of the management of the enterprise. So their most important duty is management. This doesn't say that they only do management. Somebody could be a milker supervisor, a parlor manager, the type of person. They're responsible for all 6 people that work in that parlor, but sometimes they milk a shift. That doesn't disqualify them. Or it could be someone that's like a herds person who has 2 other assistant herds persons that work for her, And, you know, she's out there most, you know, 70% of her time is out there, you know, breeding cows and working on cows and all that sort of stuff. And then only, you know, 20% of her time is involved in supervising the other two assistants. In that case, the most important part of her job is that 20%. And everybody nods their head, right? Because that's the most important part. And even though she's doing some other stuff, her primary duty is management. So she customarily then and regularly directs the work of 2 or more other employees. She has the authority to hire or fire other employees, or if that's not entirely true, look at the next one. The employee's suggestions and recommendations about hiring and firing carry considerable weight. So either of those conditions can apply. The person exercises discretionary powers, meaning they make decisions. They don't just do what they're told by someone else, they make decisions. And they're paid on a salary basis that meets the minimum. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And this, I put some links in here that you'll have in the PDF when they send that out to you. But those links lead you to some state documentation that makes this a little bit more clear. The next possible exemption is the administrative exemption. And again, this must meet all of those tests. The employee's primary duty is really performance of office or non-manual work directly related to management or general operations. Typically on farms, this would be people that are into the financial management of the business, potentially bookkeepers, that sort of thing, and increasingly people that have a human resource management responsibility. So these are administrative type tasks. They ordinarily exercise discretion and independent judgment. They regularly assist the employer and employee involved in bona fide executive or administrative capacities, and the employee is paid for their services on a salary basis. So this is most important part of their job is that administrative function, and they have to exercise some discretion. Maybe they've got access to payroll information and things like that. Those folks might well fit this administrative exemption. And then the third possibility is the professional exemption. So the job must meet these 2 requirements. These are the 2 big requirements. So the one is the employee's duty consists primarily of the performance of work that requires, and I'm looking at that top bullet then under 1, requires knowledge of advanced type in a field of science or learning. So we've got somebody that's an agronomist, studied agronomy at a university, and now they're applying those skills in their work as a crop manager on a farm. That's a professional. We've got somebody that went for dairy science to Cobleskill or to Cornell, and now they're applying those skills as a herd manager back at the farm. That sounds like a professional to me. And so they're going to fit that first one. The second bullet under number 1, original and creative. Well, we can think about that a little bit, that it takes some creativity to get your work done on a farm. It does, but that's typically thinking more about somebody that's in more of an artistic field or something like that. So we're mainly relying on that first bullet. Then number 2, the employee's work requires consistent exercise of discretion and judgment, which managers on farms certainly do that. Predominantly intellectual and varied in character. It's not rote, routine, same work every day. The output cannot be standardized. And so if it's totally standard, you know, you think about a milker's job, that is much more of a standardized type of work. Whereas a manager's job, they need to shuffle and they need to, you know, work around the schedule and they need to solve problems and stuff. And so that's different. So that's describes the professional exemption. So that's the 3. 2 of these, and you notice that under professional, there is no salary minimum for that. Oh, and I will say on this professional exemption, there are some folks that have veterinary degrees working in some larger dairies. In those situations, absolutely, they fit as long as they're doing this management type work. Minimum salary for exempt employees. This is for those 2 categories that it applies to. So for the executive and for the administrative, they have to be paid at least $937 per week this year on or after December 31st. This is just, people need to understand that there is this salary, for salary workers, there is this minimum wage that applies if they're in this exempt category. So it's just a kind of a difficult thing to find if you don't know where you're looking. Status of shareholders and their family members. So, so this situation is who's an owner, because I talked about those family members, and to be exempt as a family member, you have to be related to the owner within that third degree that we talked about. So who's an owner? Because more and more businesses have multiple shareholders involved, whether it's a partnership and an LLC or some other type of a corporate structure. So we can't give you total, very specific numbers as to what percentage of shareholder they have to be. What I can tell you is that the Department of Labor is going to interpret this in somewhat different ways. And I want to give you this example. So sometimes we see in businesses where we've got an owner that owns 95% of the business. They're essentially a sole proprietor, right? And they've got 5 employees that are 1% shareholders. They're not really shareholders. They're not really owners. In many cases, that kind of a structure is used to try to get around some of the employment laws and that sort of thing. Department of Labor is wise to that, and they won't let that stand if that's the situation. Now, let's say it's a farm that's transitioning to the next generation, and some of the next generations coming in, they've only got 1%, 2%, maybe a little bit more than that ownership, but the plan is for that to increase over the years as this transition takes place. And especially if that's a written plan somewhere, then that looks a lot more like ownership. In that case, even that small shareholder is probably going to qualify so that all of their family members can qualify as family members and get out of the overtime and the day of rest exemption. We're not going to be able to give 100% clear guidance on this until, unfortunately, case law evolves a little bit. Okay, this leads me to the pay notice and work. It used to be called agreement, and now it's called acknowledgement for farm workers. It's LS 309. You should have this in place really for all of your farm laborers, all of your managers, non-family managers. It is not required for family members. Family members are a whole new category now, and so the LS 309 is no longer required for them. But the LS 309 needs to be filled out for all those other folks, especially all those farm laborers. So most of your employees, hired farm employees, are going to need to have that filled out. I do encourage you to go ahead and fill that out again, a new one for 2021, because of all these changes, and especially for folks that are in some of these management categories that I just talked about. You're going to want to spell that out specifically and make it clear that they're not exempt from overtime and day of rest. New York minimum wage. So again, at the end of last year, we had another scheduled jump. So you see on this chart, you look across that brown bar at the top, we just passed 12/31/20. And then you go down to for all of you, you go down to the bottom row there, and that's the remainder of New York State. So that's all of upstate. So just not the city part. We had our last scheduled increase to $12.50. That's the new minimum wage. And you see at 2021, there's just an asterisk after that. Well, the state has said that we're going to get to $15 minimum wage, but we don't know now how fast it's going to happen after this $12.50 increase. Essentially, Commissioner of Labor is going to tell us by October of this year what the increase is going to be for 2022. So we don't know. We're in asterisk territory now, so we'll see how it goes from here. Actually, I overlooked a really big thing, because the wage board that just wrapped up at the end of the year, I'll just talk about that verbally for a moment. So the wage board was looking at whether the overtime threshold needed to be lowered or not. And of course, there's lots of news about that, and you can read about it anywhere in New York right now. The wage board's recommendation, and that's all it was a recommendation, was to keep the overtime threshold for farm laborers at 60 hours per week. So most likely that will continue throughout all of 2021. The wage board recommended further that the board reconvene at the end of 2021 and reconsider that. We don't know where it's going to go from there. It may stay the same. It may get locked in for a period of time. It may be on some kind of a descending threshold after that. We just don't know. We know what the recommendation is. I'm sure that had the support of the administration, so it's more than likely going to stay at 60 hours for this 1 year, but after that, we don't know. So you need to stay tuned. So let's talk about the New York's permanent paid sick leave requirement. So this was put into place again for through the Budget Act of 2020, and it required sick leave for essentially all employees in the state. And this is wider than just agriculture. This was statewide, all businesses, not just agriculture, but ag businesses had to comply. It's different amounts of leave that are required depending on the size and the income level of each business. So the first two rows on this table are for smaller businesses, small businesses with 4 or fewer employees. The first row is if they have less than $1 million of net income. Second row is if they have more than $1 million of net income. The difference there is that they both have to provide 40 hours of sick leave, but for those with less than $1 million, it is unpaid sick leave. For those with more than $1 million, it is paid sick leave. Now that, those would be smaller farms. There's lots of farms that fit into the third row there between 5 and 99 employees, and then a few that fit into the top row of over 100 employees, or the bottom row of over 100 employees. So the third row there, employers between 5 and 99, you are required to provide 40 hours of paid sick leave per employee per year. And those of you with over 100 employees, it is 56 hours. So essentially 5 days or 7 days. So employers who already provided a sick leave policy, if you already had that, that meets or exceeds these levels, then you've already met the requirement. This is not over and above anything you already required. This is just a minimum that's been put in place that everyone has to require. And another important note, if you go to the website from the state about this sick leave policy, it has a section on proposed regs. I'm not sure why it says proposed regs, but because they posted, I feel they're pretty confident that that's going to be what it will be. We at first thought the number of employees was going to be simply counting the W-2s or counting a head count of everybody that worked at the farm for the year. That's not how they're doing it. They're counting the one day out of the year that had the maximum number of employees for that day. So if any of you get some seasonal workers in, then or your workforce goes up in the summertime for cropping season and stuff like that, it's whichever day was your highest number of people, regardless of how many hours they work, even all the part-time people too. That head count is your size of employer. Okay. Important to note that this sick leave that's put in place is both sick and safe leave. Now, I won't go through all these in detail. You need to look at the state's program to get all these details. This handout has all the reasons on here, but the sick leave is for a mental or physical illness. It's both to have that illness treated, also for the diagnosis, care, or treatment. So doctor visits and so forth. For that sick leave. That's all eligible, and that's an okay reason for people to use that sick leave. The safe leave is mainly about domestic abuse situations, and it can be all kinds of things: visiting the kid's new school, visiting the district attorney's office, filing a complaint, moving house, and things like that. Anything to in this domestic violence situation. So it's both sick and safe leave. You need to be aware of that. All right, using the sick leave. After the first of the year, which is where we are now, you have to let employees use any leave that they have accrued. And you should have started to accrue leave if you're going to use that method September 30th of last year. Employees get paid at their regular rate of pay. You can set a minimum of how much increment they can use. So do they have to use a minimum of 15 minutes or a minimum of an hour? You can boost that up to as much as 4 hours. You can require them to take 4 hours at one time. We'll talk about that if we have time a little bit later, about some of the considerations around that. Employers are permitted to limit the leave taken in any year. This is important. I'll talk about this some more. They can accrue leave. So if someone gets their sick leave and they don't use it, they're going to accrue and it's going to build up. That's understandable. You can't limit how much they accrue. You can limit how much they use in a year. It's an important distinction. It's confused a lot of people. Employer, you need to notify employees about any of your leave policies and what's available to them. It's important to get this in writing for your employees. Let's talk about this accrual for a few minutes. there are two accrual options. So you either have to let them accrue it for hours that they worked at least using this 30-to-1 ratio. So for every 30 hours that they work, they get an hour of sick leave. Some people are doing that. It takes a little bit more book work or a little bit more calculation to do that. Many people are using this upfront method where they just grant the leave up front. That's really the more generous approach to take it. Accrual, as I said, a little bit more complicated. But another thing that's important to notice, that if you're giving them the 40 hours of leave that's required for most of you, they will earn that using that 30-to-1 ratio after only working 1,200 hours. And that's what some of that math is going through there. 1,200 hours gets them to 40 hours. You want to turn that accrual off unless you want them to accrue more than that, which you can. You can let them accrue more than that if that's your policy. But if you don't, and somebody works 3,000 hours for you, which would not be uncommon on farms, then they're going to accrue 100 hours of sick leave, and you may not want them to have that much. So you got to turn it off after the 1,200. If the upfront method is used, then if they don't work as much as you expected, you can't take those hours back. That's the one drawback to the upfront method. Can I use two different methods? Yes. And the reason some people might consider this, full and part-time. That's one of the real common reasons. Full-time, I'm just going to give them the hours up front and not deal with the accrual. My part-time people that are only working a few hours a week, I may not just give them hours up front. I may just have them accrue it over time. Yep, you can use two different methods. Talk about carryover for a moment more. So that unused sick, this is carryover from 1 year to the next. So if they've got unused sick time, they can carry it over to the next year. And that's unlimited. But you can limit the use of sick time. And I've got a later slide that I'll spend some more time on that. The limits that you can is the same as the minimum required. You can limit it that they can only use 40 hours if you fit that size category, or you can limit it to only using 56 hours if you fit that larger category. Now, the important thing to note here is the second bullet. You need to have a written policy if you want to have that limit in place. No written policy, then you have no limit. Okay, let's talk about it here, because just a couple of thought things. You are permitted to require that leave be used in increments, so that up to 4 hours, you can require that to be the minimum that they use. But what should the minimum be? You know, what if somebody just has a dentist appointment or a doctor appointment and they can be back in an hour? Do I really want to say, well, you can only use a 4-hour minimum? Probably not. If it were me, I'd probably use like an hour. On the other hand, 15 minutes, that's kind of short. You know, that's almost, I don't know, it's just too short of a time period to deal with. I think I would set it of an hour for just simplicity's sake, but you can set it as high as 4 hours. But basically you can't say, well, if you're going to take a day of sick leave, then you have to take a whole day and you can't come into work at all for this shift. You can't do that because you can set the max at 4 hours. Second bullet there, employees are permitted to limit the leave taken in any year to the maximum amount. That's what we just talked about. You can limit it to 40 hours or 56 hours, depending on your size. But let's think that one through, right? 40 hours. Let's say we work 10 hours shifts at our farm. That's only 4 days of leave. Somebody gets seriously sick. Let's say it's not COVID. Let's say they just get the flu or they get hurt or injured or something. You can use up 4 days in a hurry. So then they use it up here in January and it gets to be April and they're sick again. Do I want my employee feeling that they need to come back to work because they can't afford to be off and taking leave? They're not allowed to use anymore. My point here is that you can limit it to 40 hours or 56 hours, depending on your size, but do you want to? And I want you to think about that for your business. I think there ought to be some limit in most cases. People are concerned about people abusing this, but understand they first have to accrue the leave before they can abuse it. And 40 and 56 hours is all they're accruing, unless you allow them to accrue more each year. But if they accrue the leave, do you really want to not permit them to use the leave that they have accrued? Some may want to. I think it might make more sense to have a cap on it, something like 80 hours, for example. I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of abuse of sick time. While I have this thought in my mind, I'm going to share. Some of you have paid time off policies. And the question came up, are PTO policies, paid time off, Are they allowed to be used? Yes, they are. So PTO often includes sick time, includes vacation, it includes bereavement, it includes whatever the employee needs. As long as they accrue that PTO at least as fast as what the sick time says, and of course they get at least as much as what the sick time rules required, and they can use it for anything that the sick time allowable uses were, then yes, you can use that approach. And you need to notify employees in writing about that. A couple of take homes here, I'm going to wrap it up. Check your wages. Obviously the minimum wage, you do not want to be paying below minimum wage any of your employees. And a quick other thought on that, you know, if you're using salary, which you can still pay someone by salary, which means a weekly or bi-weekly pay, even if they don't fit all those exemptions. It's rare. Most people pay hourly in that situation if it's a farm laborer. But you need to track hours in that situation, because if they go over 60 hours in that week, even though you're paying them a fixed amount each week, then they are eligible for overtime. So that's really important. And you need to pay them the overtime if they go over 60 hours. Get that sick leave in place. All businesses, it's required, and you don't want to not have that. Carefully consider these adjustments to that exempt status for family and supervisors and managers. And I mean carefully. You don't want to just try to put everybody that you can try to justify as a supervisor of some sort. You don't want to just throw them all in. You've got to make sure they meet those exemptions, and you can clearly justify that. And then last, document those work relationships, including updating your LS 309s. That's the in a nutshell, what we have for 2020 and for what you need to adapt to in 2021. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Rich.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, Rich. So with all of the COVID stuff that's going on, obviously it's recommended not to have social gatherings, but when it comes to rights with the employer and the employee, and I'm thinking specifically for like religion gatherings or church, does the employer have any say or right to kind of say like yes or no their employees need to like take time off if they decide they want to partake in a social gathering of some sort, whether that's religion or anything else for that matter?
Yeah, good point. So the short answer is no. As an employer, you have no right or authority to restrict what gatherings that your employee wants to go to on their own time. So if they want to go to church, if they want to go to, you know, friend's birthday party or whatever it is, you can't restrict their movements or keep them from going to something like that. That said, you got an important tool, and that is education about the challenges. About the risks that they face, the danger, update them on how much spread is happening right now. And then, remind them about those 3 W's, right? Wear your mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. That's about all you can do there.
Have you heard much about or worked with any farms that have used the new FARM program, Workforce Development Program?
So first of all, everyone should know that module had a whole lot of New York input. There was a bunch of New York producers on there. It was people from across the country, but a lot of New York involvement there. So it's a great starting point. It's pretty comprehensive, covers a lot of bases. The key, like anything that's a template, don't just grab exactly what's there and try to put it into your farm. Adapt it for how you work and for what your needs are specifically. Take that template of tools that are provided there and adapt it so that it works for you and for your team, and so you can do it practically. Because if you've got good intentions to do something but then you never do it, well, then you've accomplished nothing. In fact, you probably caused a problem. So a couple of thoughts there. And then another, what Tom was saying is absolutely important for the engagement of the employees. That's a critically important piece of it. But another thing that we need to be talking about more and more in the dairy industry is that, it used to be that we operate our dairy farm out in the rural area and nobody bothered us. And, we got to put our product into the market and, everybody leave me alone about how I manage. Well, those days are gone. And people downstream, whether it is your co-op or it is Chobani or it is the consumer that's walking through that grocery aisle, they're interested and they're looking about how you care for your animals and now how you care for your people. And so we've got to step up to the mark. We've got to be much more conscious about all these other people that now are taking an interest. Again, whether you like it or not, and I know a lot of us don't like it, it's reality today, and we need to address it.
So this question is for Chris. Chris, I feel like over the past year, maybe 2 years, or maybe even further beyond that, farmers may be up in the air on whether or not they want to or should buy into the price protection programs. Do you have any advice for producers that may still be up in the air about making those decisions?
Sure. That's a good question, Casey. Well, it's a little late to buy the DMC now. I mean, I don't know what percent. It's a little more than half of, I think, New York dairy farmers signed up for the dairy margin coverage program, which is very much aimed at small and medium-sized herds because of that. Because the first 5 million pounds is where you're going to get your return. That above that, it's not economical. It just costs too much. And frankly, the way they've set that program up, it's going to pay about 2/3 of the time. And my advice, if you're not doing a lot of risk management, is to look at that program first and see if that's going to be sufficient. It's not a huge amount of money either way. But after that, I think the big thing is to look at your financial statements and see what kind of financial risk you've got there. A good balance sheet, accrual adjusted income statement, get some idea of where your profitability, solvency, and liquidity situation is, and whether it makes sense, whether you I think that can help you decide whether you need to have risk management. If if you're sitting on the knife's edge as far as a solvency trigger there, and frankly, if you get a debt to asset ratio above 50%, the lenders are going to charge you more on your loans, and it's going to add a lot to your cost. Are you in a position where your liquidity is really tight and you can't afford to be losing a lot? Then that's telling you, I think, that maybe you need to look harder at risk management. Dairy Revenue Protection Program has some opportunities, especially I think if you're out there 9 to 15 months out, where you can be looking to roll and lock in some price protection there. I'm not somebody that thinks everybody needs it. I think you need to talk to your lender, and I think it can work for a lot of farms. So let me just kind of leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you again to our speakers for your presentations.